What is Freemasonry?
Freemasonry is essentially, it's kind of a concept or an alternative to religion, or a spiritual path, if you will. The etymology of Freemasonry is actually very interesting. We have the word free, of course, and then masonry. Free, when it was referred to in this respect, free, it actually, if we look up the etymological background of that word, it refers to somebody who is beloved, or somebody who is, rather, I want to use the word beloved, but rather somebody who is actually appreciated in a tribe or a clan. And what that refers to particularly is a sovereign, actually. When we use the word free in this context, it means somebody without debt, somebody without obligation, or subservient to a hierarchy. And so in that respect, what it really means is as a sovereign. And essentially this can be applied to a magi, it could be applied to a king, it could be applied to a yogi, it could be applied to just anybody who's a sovereign in the respect that they're not obligated due to their, I guess, karmic inferiority to some type of a superior, whether it's a government, whether it's a king, whether it's a president. And that's where the word free comes from, and this is actually the first, I guess, the prefix of the word Freemasonry. Masonry, of course, is a builder, somebody who makes. That's where the word comes from. And in this context, it refers to a maker of society. It doesn't necessarily refer to a mason in the respect that, you know, somebody who slaps mortar on a brick and then constructs a house. It's actually somebody who builds society, either through the psychological endeavor, the philosophical endeavor, the spiritual endeavor, architectural, economic, just essentially an enlightened individual, a free, sovereign individual who's a contributor, a positive contributor to the human race. And so we find this word Freemasonry, actually what it means etymologically is just essentially a spiritual seeker or a spiritually enlightened individual who contributes positively towards the construction of humanity as a whole.
I notice Freemasonry has a lot of symbology and uses a lot of symbology. What's the reason for that?
Well, the idea of using symbols is actually an interesting concept, and it's that in itself can be a topic way beyond the scope of just a 10 or 20 or 30-minute interview. But even our alphabet's essentially symbols. It's letters that we interpret as symbols having certain sounds and meanings. And the reason that they started using symbols long before in Freemasonry, rather than to attempt to articulate certain profound spiritual concepts, mysteries, or revelations, was that there's just certain things that cannot be explained, that cannot essentially be explained in using words or philosophy or logical deduction or assertion or even through forcing somebody, because there's a certain magic that meditation, through the practice of meditation, can reveal after a long time. And this is what the objective of experience is, you know. There's always that reason that you see somebody, you know, wisdom can never be substituted for experience. And so you really need to experience certain things, and these symbols are generally experiences of certain spiritual enlightenments that one has along the path of Masonry when they research certain philosophical documents or creeds, or, you know, a lot of the rabbinical texts that are integrated into something like morals and dogma. They use symbols to try to interpret the base meaning of that message. So, like, one example would be the cross, you know, the symbol of the cross. What does that represent? To most people, it represents Jesus Christ. And in point of fact, you could say it represents Jesus Christ, but to mystics, it actually represents the four elements in perfect unison, which create a type of portal opening to the etherical realm, which is why, again, but that's accurate, it's just a more substantial way of describing that symbol. So you know, we have the lowest echelon where most people would say, you know, the cross represents Jesus Christ and he's love, that's it. They couldn't really enumerate on it any further than that. The more mystical, esoteric student or individual or seeker would say, well, it's the four elements, the four esoteric elements in unison, which open the etherical element, which open the etherical port, and really you become a type of sun nexus where you can have communication with this side, the spirit side, and this and that side. Well, that side, excuse me, the spirit side, and then this side, the physical side. And then, of course, you know, to some individuals, then the concept of Jesus Christ or the cross goes back to the eternal life, where the cross comes from. The Ankh, the Egyptian Ankh, is where actually the Christian cross comes from. But that's kind of a short example of some of the symbolism that they use.
So what's with all the masonry symbology and activity around the States and Europe?
Well, what's happening, I think, right now is, you know, Freemasonry, and because of the Illuminati, is getting more attention than it ever has in the past, and unfortunately a lot of negative attention. People are associating it with a lot of the bad things that are happening, you know, with all the medias, with all the corruption. And again, there are rather certain individuals and certain organizations that have these things, but the attention that it's getting today is, I think personally what's happening is we're transitioning rather, from an old world order into a new world order. And the new world order isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it's just what the new world order is essentially that the star, or rather the constellation Aquarius, will be ruling the general populace versus the Piscean constellation, which has been in rule. According to Freemasonry, then that transition officially started around 1850, 1870, and I think 2012 is the halfway demarcation point when it officially, it comes from the halfway point from Piscean, and it's going to be officially the majority of more of an Aquarian age, and that's the 2012, and then coming in, the actual official age of Aquarius is going to come in about 150 years from now. And so what I think is happening is there's a battle rather, between spiritual superiorities like the Roman Catholic Church, Freemasonry being one of them, and people are trying to vie for spiritual dominance over the population. And so what I think people are trying to do, or rather they're trying to introduce, there are certain people that are trying to introduce Freemasonry into the general populace and have them adopt it as their new spiritual path, their new spiritual religion, if you will. You see a lot of people coming away from traditional Christianity, and a lot of even, what could be considered formally as Jewish people. They're kind of becoming more liberated and looking towards a more spiritual aspect. A lot of people are getting into Kabbalah now. And I think what that whole undertone is there are certain people that are working very sly and subtly, and I don't even know, again, you just see the effects of their cause. Who these people are, nobody knows, but I can guarantee they're not public. And they're trying to usher in a new type of spirituality with the New Age. The New Age is a type of new spiritual behavior, more humanitarian-based, a slightly more logical, slightly more heart-based, but they're trying to introduce a new spiritual religion, if you will, versus, and as the old ways kind of go out, over the next 10, 15, 20, 150 years ultimately. In 2012 is, I think, the official demarcation, halfway mark of that transition.
In essence, you could say that Freemasons are very set in their traditions.
Yes, absolutely. Freemasonry is just Freemasonry. It's something that you have to understand. It's not a group of individuals that are even secret societies, and Freemasonry are not synonymous. Fraternal orders and Freemasonry are not synonymous. Again, the Freemason is a person who seeks through their own endeavors to try to spiritually enlighten the individual. Then you have things like fraternal orders like the Illuminati, or or Skull and Bones, for example, and these are subsidiary types of secret orders, but they're not necessarily Freemasons as such. So when they're set in their ways and traditions, they have, there are certain rituals and traditions, both in the Scottish Rite Freemasonry and also in the English Rite Freemasonry. There are certain rituals that candidates go through to ascend towards their spiritual path. But none of them are really fixed as such. I mean, the Scottish Rite has 33, the English Rite has 13, and then every, literally hundreds of certain Masonic orders that exist in the world, every single one has their own specific type of ritual that you go to get initiated and then escalate towards the echelons of the higher-ups in that particular order.
So, as far as Masons, what are some notable Masons in history, even today, that you could identify for us?
Well, that's something that the individual should go on, like Google search famous Masons, because the list is actually very, very, very extensive. But some notable Freemasons are actually George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson. All of these individuals were actually notable Freemasons. Andrew Jackson himself was an Illuminati, and later he resigned actually from the order itself. So a lot of, Theodore Roosevelt was a Freemason, Eisenhower was a Freemason. There were a lot of individuals that most people wouldn't even suspect that are actors, politicians. Most judges are actually Freemasons. A lot of people don't know that. Most judges, all the way from, the local appellate courts all the way to the Supreme Court, just about every single judge is a Freemason. So if you wanted an extensive list, I would suggest just going to YouTube and searching famous or notable Freemasons, and there's people that have done extensive lists of literally A to Z, from actors, politicians, money people, bankers, religious individuals, even that are subservient to certain sects in Christianity and Judaism and whatnot. So it's a pretty extensive list, but those are some of the ones. George Washington, even George Bush was to some extent a Freemason in the respect that he was in certain orders.
Okay, is there any particular author that you could recommend that you could get that might even himself be a Freemason that gives a really great insight on Freemasonry?
I would say probably the #1 book, all around encompassing best book if an individual doesn't want to literally pursue a life of researching Freemasonic text, is Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma. It's a pretty extensive book. It's about 870 some odd pages. But that book, it is essentially the cream of the crop of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry. And Albert Pike enumerates in that book and he actually didn't write the book solely. He even gives credit to those were the authors throughout the centuries. Then he later contributed, compiled it, and made it public. But he didn't actually write all the text in the 870 some odd pages. But that book, probably in my opinion, is one of the best books ever published in Western literature as an all-in-one encompassing book regarding spirituality, religion, history, politics, money, everything in together, because that's the objective. Remember, when we seek spirituality, we shouldn't just go towards one path, towards Christianism or some kind of occultism or mysticism. We should explore every path. You should explore economy and how that integrates into the people's psychology, and then how states and organizations work on people's spirituality, because it really all does kind of sync together at the end of the day. They're not individual things, even though people would think so, but they're not individual things. And an example of that would be if you're in an airplane and you look down at a city like Los Angeles, and you look down in the city, you just see a bunch of lights. But then when you get closer, you see things like the freeways, and you essentially see cars, thousands of cars moving up forward, and you see lights on them. You see red lights and you see white lights, which is interesting. You have blood cells in the body, which are essentially red blood cells and white blood cells, and they're essentially moving across each other. One going into the heart, one coming out of the heart, and then you can kind of compare. Just for example, this like macrocosmic example, you can compare the highways of Los Angeles to the veins or the main arteries, for example, of the body, and then the streets to the veins, and then maybe like the cul-de-sacs to the capillaries. And there's this occult connection, this mystic, I guess if you will, mystic connection between all these things, because even though things seem that they're different, they're really not. And that is one of the aspects of the spiritual pursuit, is to actually recognize the unifying general field and concept of all things that apparently seem different. So, on that, in that context, that's why I suggest people. It's a very difficult read. It's a very you have to be pretty up on your grammar, because it was written in the 1800s. 1871, I believe it was published in that era. So it's a pretty extensive read, but well worth it. And you'll learn about things that you just will not read in any other book. And of course, there's tons and tons of good Freemasonic literature out there, but that's probably one of the better ones, I think. If you wanted one book, that's the one, Albert Pike's Moral and Dogma.
You're giving me a lot of information, and that leads me into my next question. Where do you get all of your information? Because your knowledge is broad about the subject of Freemasonry alone.
I've actually researched, not researched, I've been a pretty avid and reader of Albert Pike's Moral and Dogmas for about 3.5, 4 years now. I myself am not a Freemason, but when I picked up the text and I originally started reading it, I felt it was extremely profound. It pretty much hit a lot of things right on target. It goes into the extensive vocabulary, or the knowledge of magic, even towards the later chapters of the magic of what it actually means to become a sovereign, what it means to be free and exempt from the phenomenal world. Well, even years before that, I was researching Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and the Kundalini Yogas, which is the more mystical aspect of the yogas, it's essentially liberation of the phenomenal senses, but it's more of the Eastern document. And when we go towards the West, then you essentially see these authors reading the same thing. So where I get most of my stuff in terms of the Freemasonic stuff, in my opinion, Albert Pike probably released the most in-depth, best collection of Freemasonic literature, which is at least available to the public readily. Then that's why I went there in that direction. Otherwise, other good stuff which is very related to that kind of stuff is get a good book on the Kabbalah. Get good literature on the I Ching, and get good literature also on the yogas. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is good literature, and it all ties in together, even though these things might seem like they're completely different fields. If you understand the message, or read between the lines, you really understand that all authors, all religions are ultimately saying the same thing, and it's a very intriguing adventure to read this kind of stuff.
So basically it's sounding like that Freemasonry isn't a Western idea.
No. Albert Pike credits Freemasonry roots all the way back to ancient Egypt, long before Christianity or even Judaism. And that's why they even tried to get away from dogmatic behavior, and this is why people are so spooked out about Freemasons and think they're devil worshippers and they work behind the scenes, because the objective is not to be public like Christian and go have a cross on the church. The idea is more that kind of seek knowledge and you'll find us kind of thing. We're there, but if you're not looking for it, we're not going to make ourselves public. And it's kind of, the idea is that people tend to value things more that they work for rather than when they're given to them. And so in this respect, Freemasonry has its roots, Albert Pike credits Scottish Rite Freemasonry as opposed to English Rite Freemasonry created in 1717 in that time frame. Scottish Rite Freemasonry has its roots all the way back to ancient Egypt, So we're talking like in the 4,000 or 5,000 years ago.
You mentioned it a few times and you kind of just threw it to the side. Basically that Freemasonry, people associate it with satanic.
Right.
So would you consider, or I know there's people out there that do consider Freemasonry evil, would you consider them evil?
Absolutely not. And that doesn't mean, a lot of people get Freemasonry to be evil from two sources. The primary one of Freemasoners being devil worshippers actually came as a result of a hoax by a lawyer, a Catholic lawyer we're talking about the 1850s now, and you can Wikipedia and Google search this is all common knowledge. There was a Catholic lawyer by the name of Leo Taxtel who the Catholic Church actually funded to intentionally release documents about Freemasonry, that Freemasons were devil worshippers and they got involved in orgies and sex sacrifices, because in my opinion the Roman Catholic Church, of course, wanting a spiritual monopoly in the world, and you can that's evident in their actions throughout history, I think felt threatened towards Freemasonry, because again, when you just pick up books like out of many, Morals and Dogma, the information is so profound. I think that if it ever became mainstream, it would have a pretty good chance of overriding the blind dogmatic faith of Christianity, or anything even in that realm, even because it just gets in a lot more depth about the psychology, the spiritual dynamic, the magical dynamic of the human being. It talks about a lot of Oriental history. It talks about the fact that Western religion is essentially the newest seed of a much older concept that comes from the Orients. And so that's where that came from. It's actually called the Leo Taxtel hoax. You can Google search that term. It's Leo. The individual's name is Leo Taxtel, Taxil. And it's even been publicly disclosed as a hoax today. And that's where most people will reference Freemasonic literature, or even Freemasons being devil worshippers. Now, on that note, it doesn't mean that there aren't sinister organizations out there which umbrella themselves or which have permeated certain orders of Freemasonry, and they work to the benefit of it. Like the orders of the Illuminati, they do really exist, and some of their intentions could be dubbed as sinister towards the human race. From some people, because I guess they rationalize that there's simply too many people to govern adequately. So they do advocate population control, sterilization, eugenics. I mean, all this stuff does come from certain echelons of Freemasonry, but for the most part, it's like even the intention of a cop is to be a good person to help. Now, it doesn't mean that there aren't bad, corrupt cops. It exists, but it's the person that makes the person, not the organization that makes the person. So Freemasonry, again, irrespective of what people make it to be or what kind of individuals join, Freemasonry, again, it's just a path, is what it is. Yoga's a path, Buddhism's a path, Freemasonry is a path. That's what it is. So evil and Freemasonry shouldn't be associated together any more than than Jesus and evil, or the Talmud and evil, or Kabbalah and evil, because again, it's just one path towards spiritual salvation.
There's been rumors that there's an inner conflict in Freemasonry, or some might label, if you're looking at it in an emotional sense, that there's an evil and a good Freemason. Mm-hmm. Is there a conflict between them within the Freemasonry society?
I think absolutely so. And again, we have to be very, very careful when we start talking about words like good and bad and right and wrong, because it's a completely relative term, and I'm just gonna, just one very broad example. If I take a gun and I shoot somebody out on the street here, everybody's gonna think I'm insane, I'm a criminal, I ought to be locked up, hands down. But if I do the same thing overseas, there's some people that would reward me with a medal. But if I go down the street and I shoot a rapist in the head, you know, somebody's raping a little girl, everybody would applaud me. So it's not necessarily, the point of that analogy was it's not necessarily what you do, but why you do what you do. And with that said, you have to kind of take that concept and then apply it towards these factions which are fighting amongst each other. Because a lot of them, they're doing certain things in the benefit, or they would like to believe, the benefit of humanity as a whole. 9/11 was a perfect example. There's no doubt that 9/11 was, it had many influences, and I think it had very little to do with oil as much as it had to do with cultural conformity across the board, again ushering in the Aquarian Age. 9/11 was very symbolic because it knocked down the Twin Towers. The Twin Towers, of course, is a very Masonic and Kabbalistic symbol of Jachin and Boaz, which is the dual polarities of the universe, and it actually has a lot to do with that. They knocked it down. They waited 10 years, which is a complete cycle, right? We have 10 is a complete cycle, and then and it happened on the first year of the new millennium, right? 2001. 9/11 is the number of transition in numerology. They waited 10 years, and now they're, you know, last year they finished or they started the completion of the One World Tower, which is basically, if you read between the lines, what they're saying is we're done with the New World, we're starting, we're done with the Old World, we're starting a new world, and here's the building, because economy, obviously money runs the world for the majority of people, so it's telling you that. I saw an interesting article on Yahoo that actually specifically said that. Again, if you know your terminology, then you see it. They specifically wrote for the One World Tower in New York, like a phoenix out of ashes rises the One World Tower. Now the phoenix is a very key word here because that's a legendary bird, which again, it's a legendary bird between the raven, which is the dark, and the dove. It's a hybrid bird. Of course it didn't exist, but it's a legendary bird that they say does exist according to the folklore of Freemasonry. But, you know, back to the topic, is there a struggle? There is. There are very powerful factions that fight amongst each other, and they're essentially, again, like you asked a little bit earlier, they're vying for spiritual authority. You know, who's going to be the next Vatican after the Vatican's done? You know, the church is basically, it's a matter of time before they go under with the sex scandals. People are starting to see how much property they own, they get upset, you know, with the corruption, you know, and these things are permeating through. And we're really at the early stages of that, but the Vatican will naturally have to fail because or it'll at least have to reborn itself in a different way. So to answer the question shortly, yes, there are very powerful factions. And are they evil? I think everybody has their own methods of their madness. I'm not advocating it's good to kill people, but that's kind of their objective. You know, what they see, like when they go to Iraq, it doesn't have much to do with oil or money. It's about cultural conformity, and you hear that all the time. We want to go into Iraq to democratize them. We want to go into Iran to democratize them. What does that mean, democratize? Well, what you're saying is we want you to be like us. That's what they're saying. It's cultural conformity. And that's what all this bloodshed has to do with. And it's nothing different than, you know, the Crusades in the early, 800-900 years ago. And it's nothing different than, you know, all the wars. It's always been about cultural conformity, and money has something to do with it, but not for the higher-ups authorizing these things. So there are definitely, they're not only Freemasons, but a lot of them are very spiritually knowledgeable, spiritually powerful individuals that do, I think, understand magic to a notable degree.
Is there anything on that topic of the phoenix that you wanted to finish up? Because you kind of stopped. You stopped with the the raven, the dove being a hybrid, and the phoenix as it rises from the ashes.
Right. Well, that's again, it's in one of the rituals. There's this type of symbolic, and this is even the rituals in South America. When people go through fire, it's essentially like fire, like you see behind me. Spiritually, fire represents a type of rebirth. It takes what's old, and it goes through a spiritual process, and then it sheds out, the new. That's what it does essentially. And this is also why people burn incense in spiritual practices, even in any kind of worship or seances, they're burning stuff. Why? Because the burning is a representation from the physical, and it goes through transmutation. It goes through this energy, which is the fire, and then it goes into smoke. Where? Nobody knows. The ether to the spiritual. That's the whole objective of burning stuff, or using fire in spiritual rituals. So going back to the phoenix, this was a Yahoo News article, and it wasn't too long ago, about 2-3 months ago. I saw it. You could even see it if somebody wanted to do the research and just typed in One World Tower. You could probably see it because it was the first paragraph in this article, and it essentially talked about the fact that it said that was the title of the ad. Like a phoenix rising out of the ashes, the One World Tower comes into being. It's something to that extent, but I just remember the phoenix and the ashes rising because The phoenix, again, it was a legendary bird, and it's even, you see this all over. It's a very Masonic tradition, which is essentially, and it's an Indian, Native American Indian tradition as well, where essentially the phoenix is this legendary bird which has through its spiritual endeavor, it has the black in perfect balance with the white. It has the dove of peace with the evil raven, and it's become perfect unison, and it becomes this radical, beautiful bird. Phoenix, it's black, but it's in flames, and it looks beautiful, and that's the whole objective of what a phoenix is. And rising out of the ashes, it's a spiritual process. And just like I mentioned a little bit before, when they knocked down the Twin Towers, it was a message. Granted, it was a pretext to go to Iraq, but I'm talking about something else. It was a spiritual process. They had to do it. They hit it on 9/11, which is in numerology, 9/11 means a transition. It means some kind of a transition.
Why would people that are striving to create a society to better themselves label themselves Freemason? Where does that word come from?
So we have essentially the prefix free and then the suffix masonry. And free essentially refers to a sovereign, somebody who has been liberated from the dual, the dual phenomenality of the world. Basically, you don't love, but you don't hate. And I might say that wrong, because it is not, you don't necessarily like or you don't dislike. You don't go ups and downs, because the idea is that you've consciously equilibrated yourself and you see beyond the physical existence, as it were, and your consciousness abides towards a spiritual principle rather than the physical necessities of life, as it were. That in itself is a much more different concept, but when we talk about Freemasons, a free builder, a sovereign builder, that's what it really means. You're sovereign. You've liberated from the physical existence. You don't necessarily hate people, and you don't necessarily go, you're not a protagonist or an antagonist. You become the raven, right? Just like we talked about. You've mastered that equilibrium between good and evil, and you become something a little bit more, a type of principle, a spiritual principle, because your consciousness is polarized towards the spirit. Mason, again, just simply means a builder of society, somebody who contributes favorably or propitiously towards society, towards the human development, which is, again, that's a slightly different subject. But if we look at the human race as a culture, which is developing like a bacteria, for lack of a better term, there are certain bacteria that contribute favorably towards the expansion of a more dynamic, of a more creative, of a more progressive human, and then there's those that don't contribute to it. Ultimately, again, this goes into a metaphysical concept that there's no such thing as good and bad. There's just some people that help the human race evolve more. You could even see that. I mean, if you're reasonable within your own judgments, you could really deduce that everything that human race exists, or enjoys today, like lights and structures and water, that can really be contributed to, 0.00001% of all the humans that existed. Most people, unfortunately, don't. I guess they don't have the desire, the need to want to contribute to society positively.
Let me just straight up ask you, are you a Freemason?
No.
Have nothing to do with them, never associated with them?
I was never, I don't believe that one needs to get involved in groups or be titled or get some kind of a title to pursue the spiritual indwellingness within themselves. I think I personally think spirituality is a very intimate, private matter. The individual should seek within themselves and should struggle within themselves. Of course, look for help on the outside if you get stuck or if you want help or advice, but this type of glorification of Freemasonry, I'm a Freemason and here's my badges and here's my rank and all this, I think that's just spiritual prostitution, and I don't like that kind of stuff. So as a result, therefore, I have not chosen to be initiated into any kind of Freemasonic order. So a Freemason is essentially a sovereign individual who has, through the spiritual path, liberated their body and helped essentially humanity in some positive respect.